So the last time I preached, I told you that I was going to be preaching on the two books of the Bible that have women's names attached to them. So last time I preached on Esther, and now today I'm going to begin this two-parter on the book of Ruth. A couple of things about the book of Ruth. It's very short. It's 4 chapters. But it is integral. It is integral to both the story of Israel and to our story as Christians. Ruth holds a key component. And that key component I'm going to talk about next week. This week I want to look specifically at the passages we just heard. Because they're rich and they're much more foreboding than we might think. Listening to them today, some 4,000 or 5,000 years after the fact, we lose some of the content because we aren't really aware of the realities that these women were facing. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a rundown, because the first thing that we hear is that Elimelech and his family, so Elimelech and Naomi and their 2 sons, they leave Bethlehem and they go to Moab. What we don't know, or what we don't really inform ourselves about now, is that Moab was a very unfriendly place, place to Israelites. There was long-standing conflict between the two. And so the idea that Naomi and Elimelech would take their family into Moab, that's a first sign of just how desperate the times were, how deep the drought and how deep the famine was, that it affected them in such a way. Then the story tells us that not only did they move to Moab, but Naomi and Elimelech allowed their sons to marry Moabite women. So now that would have been scandalous back home in Bethlehem. If people heard about that, they would have been scandalized, and the family would have been basically what's the word? Shunned. Thank you. Shunned by their own community. Okay. So here they are. There's Elimelech and Naomi, their 2 sons, their 2 Moabite daughters-in-law, and then the unthinkable happens. Elimelech dies, leaving Naomi alone with her sons and daughters-in-law in this foreign land. And then both the sons die. The fear that would have been in her heart is intense. I don't think we can imagine it. So then she decides she's going to go home. She's going to go home shamed. Shamed because not only did they go to Moab, their sons married Moabite women, but now she's widowed and sonless, and she's returning a broken woman. And her 2 daughters-in-law decide to follow her. So now it's a little bit of reverse. You have 2 Moabite women who are now going to journey into the land of Israel, facing all of the prejudice and bias that the first family was facing when they went to Moab. And then we hear that on the road, Naomi stops and says to her daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, "Don't come with me. Don't come with me. Because you would be moving towards a time of incredible difficulty. It's one thing for me to do that, but I cannot ask you to do it." And Orpah, hearing Ruth's concern and listening to her words says, no, that you're probably right. And she went back to her family, which is what would have been expected. That's what would have been expected. Ruth actually breaks all kinds of rules in this story to follow Naomi back to Bethlehem with all of the unknowns, with all of the dangers, with all of Ruth, and Ruth breaks the rules. Nobody would have thought twice. If Ruth had joined Orpah and they held hands and they walked down the road back to their own families, nobody would have thought any worse about either one of them. Naomi actually encouraged them to do that, but Ruth follows. To such a point that the words that Ruth uses when she's speaking to Naomi, that we just heard Reverend Cheryl read and Fran sing, the words that say, don't urge me to leave you. Don't urge me to turn back. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. I do not think that we fully understand the depth of that. And it's become, and I actually love when people use this for weddings, but it's become something like it's a little pithy reading that we use for weddings. But the level of engagement, and not only the level of engagement, but the depth of commitment and the willingness to face the unknown with all of its dangers and all of its fears are held in those words. But they are also words of incredible faith. So what I want to talk about this morning, just for a brief time, is the current plight of people who are forced, whether through violence in their communities or in their streets, or poverty or hunger, or the changing climate that is actually wiping out habitats and causing islands that are inhabited right now to sink into the ocean, so that the people who live there have to move. That sense of movement, of migration, of forced emigration, and just what it takes, what people need to be thinking about, and how, like, their mindset when they move forward into those situations, and how important it is, one, to have people, companions, so those who travel with you, those who break bread with you, allies who are supporting you in some way along the road, and also that sense of being connected to something greater than yourself, myself, themselves. Sean, can you pass me the... Thank you. We hear the stories every day in the news. We in this congregation have heard the stories firsthand of the circumstances that are faced by, in our situation, 35 refugees, if we include all of the Syrians who have passed through our doors, but millions of people who, faced with war or climate change, or as in this story, famine and drought, are forced to leave their homes and move to a place that is unknown, and at points, or in certain situations, unfriendly, sometimes uncompromising. And so we have this story of Naomi and Elimelech who leave what we know and what they knew at the time as the promised land, but leaving it into an unknown for a period of time. But when they get to Moab, they know that they are now in a dangerous situation and alone. The four of them, they're a unit. But somewhere along the line in that story, as they entered into Moab, they were extended hospitality that they did not expect. They were extended such hospitality that they believed that it would be okay for their Jewish sons to marry Moabite women. And then the expectation was that they would settle, that their children would have children, that they would celebrate, as I just did a couple of days ago, with my grandson in Nova Scotia, as I did yesterday with Logan. They would sit with their families. They would grow old. That was the expectation. But then we know that tragedy hit. So now Naomi is faced with another decision, another choice, and for some it would seem an impossible decision to make. But she leaves and returns home. We'll hear more about what happens after that next week. But I want us to reside in that space that is fear-filled, that is danger-filled, that is the trepidation of going into that foreign land, and then the trepidation of returning home, shamed. And I want us to think about all of the people in our communities today for whom that is a reality. Those who have left their homeland, and then when they get to their new place, they think, it wasn't so bad, even though we know the horror. And when they think about returning home, some of them, their thought becomes, but how do I face those who I left in the first place? How do I bring my now foreignness back into my family? But those aren't the only situations, right? Reverend Cheryl and I left Nova Scotia to come to Ontario. Part of that was financial. There was a need. I have to tell you a story. Sorry, it just popped into my head, but it fits really well. In Bass River, Nova Scotia, little small community, there is a pizza place. And the pizza place is the back kitchen of someone's house. And when you go to order the pizza, if you look to your left, I took pictures because I thought it was so, unique. You look to the left, and there's a backyard filled with ducks, chickens, and turkeys. They're just sort of wandering around. And when I went to the pizza to the window at the pizza place, and the woman comes to the door, and she says, "What can I get you?" And I said, "Do you do a Canadian pizza here?" And she said, "No, we don't, because we're not from Ontario." I was like, "What?" She said, "A Canadian pizza, you don't find a Canadian pizza outside of Ontario." And I said, "Well, do you do pepperoni, mushroom, and bacon?" She said, "Oh yeah, we do that." I said, "Well, that's a Canadian." She said, "Not here, it isn't." So I said to her, "Oh my God, I'm a come from away again." And she said, "If you're going to order a Canadian pizza here, yeah, you are." That's a small, like, that's a smidge, right? Like, I was once a come from away. Then I lived in the Maritimes for quite some time, and because in Cape Breton I could tell people I was from Scotland, I wasn't a come from away anymore. But now I'm a come from away again and embarrassing myself by ordering a pizza. In this story, all of these pieces of foreignness become very real. And the relationship between this family and their community in Moab, of these women after the deaths of all of their husbands and sons, and the other part of the story is that neither Orpah or Ruth had children. So now you have two women, Ruth and Naomi, who are going into a community on their own with no resources, no assets, and no males in their lives. And we cannot imagine what that means at that time. But again, I want to encourage us to think about all of those people in our lives, in our communities, in our neighborhoods, in our country, and in the world who are moving into this great unknown. I talked to a gentleman yesterday as we were leaving the hospital whose wife had a breakdown and ended up in the psychiatric ward. And she's on the mend, like she's getting well. But it was obvious, the unknowns were just overwhelming. People who want to introduce themselves into these foreign situations, even when they think they might have friends and allies. But the difficulty of doing that, going into the unknown, they are all around us. They are all around us. First Nations peoples who are trying to re-engage with their own traditions. Gay and lesbian people who are trying to figure out a way to live their full selves in their communities, in their families sometimes. Women who are faced with the realities of separation, divorce, single parenthood, with no concept of how this is going to unfold. When we gather here on Sunday mornings, we gather here to hear Scripture, because Scripture is what we as Christians hold to guide our lives and to guide the way that we interact. As we said in the call to worship, we shared the words of Deuteronomy. To love the Lord your God with all your strength, all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And both of those are held in concert, because the way we love our neighbor is an indication of how we love God. Someone said you cannot say you love God and then ignore your neighbor. And who is your neighbor? Jesus tells us it's everybody, including your worst enemy. For the Moabites, the people coming from Israel into their land, they were their neighbor. Not everybody in Moab knew that at the time, but this family did. When Ruth and Naomi returned to Bethlehem, who were their neighbors, or who were the neighbors of the people in Bethlehem? Ruth and Naomi were. They didn't all know it at that time. But someone showed such great hospitality that it affected the history of an entire people, an entire faith, and not only one, but others that followed. So I encourage you, here's where I finish. I encourage you today to engage in this story, to really immerse yourself into the story and to imagine this family and then these two women and where they had to go, who they had to rely on, how others' faiths were demonstrated in their lives, and then who are the people who are entering into our lives? Who are the people who are coming into our spaces with those unknowns and those fears and those trepidations and the true danger? And how can we be the one who offers hospitality? How can we be the one who says, not only are you welcomed, but you are celebrated and you are loved? That is the call of the scriptures, and that is the call of the gospel in our lives. So let us hear it, own it, embrace it, and live it. Thanks be to God.